Hello and welcome to another edition of Novara here on Resonance 104.4 FM, London's number one radio station. I'm Aaron Bastani, at Aaron Bastani on Twitter, and as is often the case, I'm joined by fellow co-founder of Novara Media, James Butler, at Piers Penless. Hi, James.
Hi.
Today we'll be discussing Europe and the EU, exploring whether the current institutions which define the governance of this continent, the European Commission and the ECB being chief among them, are a fundamental limit on possibilities for radical democratic change. James, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, there's a double question here, really, and I think in one sense we have to focus our attention in a rather difficult way on two separate things that are hard to bring together. One is the domestic political situation that we have here. So we're going to be faced with, or apparently be faced with, a referendum on EU membership in the course of the next year, possibly in the next 2 years, but probably in 2016. David Cameron seems very, very enthusiastic about that. That is supposed to happen on the back of renegotiation and the idea that by cutting loose of sort of somewhat mythical EU red tape, we will release domestic productivity in the UK. We will do so by apparently signing away workers' rights and so on. That's going to be very exciting. There's also, of course, the standard questions that attend referenda. And that is exactly how a question is phrased. That is, in situations like these, the extent to which they're binding. These are, of course, all questions that have come up recently in Greece. And that question of national sovereignty is hugely important there. So those questions about the limits of plebiscites and the difference between the Greek situation and the British one are going to be important. There are, I think, several... And so perhaps the way into this is to say that we can look at the perspectives held by various sections of the left and capital and the right in terms of EU membership, and those are going to differ between nation states, and the British ones are particularly important, I think, and they're particularly important because they're a bit weird. Now, one of the things that is perhaps not frequently remembered is that the debate on European membership, or membership of the common market, as was EU now, has happened in this country and has happened within living memory. It happened, it was called, rather preposterously, the Great Debate by many of its partisans in the end of the 60s, early 1970s, 71. There is an excellent book-length essay by Tom Nairn on this called the Left Against Europe. It's an examination of these questions. But the perspectives on the issue of membership as they stand today differ across political divides. So there's a sort of soft left reformist position which sees European membership as generally a good thing, as defanging nationalism, and particularly as guaranteeing a certain species of liberal protection against the depredations of UK capitalist class, and that's in particular in terms of human rights, which are of course a bone of contention these days. There's a harder left position, and it's one that has never really moved away from its position in the early 70s. Now, I have always been somewhat suspicious about this position, partly because it presumes that the basis of the European Union is sheer capitalism protected by sheer bureaucracy. And that isn't actually true. But it was a very popular position in the early 70s, and it's somewhat waned in popularity since, partly because of the experience of Thatcherism in the UK, and partly through the strange experience of the Blair years and the sort of strange positions taken by the right in those years. But the position points out that the EU is primarily a mechanism for the free flow of capital, and that has been part of its foundational ideation. And the pretensions to a social Europe, which have occasionally preoccupied the left or the Europhile left, they seem to really evaporate after about 1986. It exists only as a spectre after then. So the case for opposition is mounted both in economic terms. Now, historically, that was the difference between common agricultural policy, food prices, and those food prices available in the Commonwealth. That is no longer such an issue. And these days it tends to be questions about the dominance of Germany and its sort of client states within Europe, and particularly at the moment Germany's treatment of debtor nations. The second way the question is mounted is in political terms, and that is to argue that any potential left government will be hobbled by adherence to EU fiscal rules, the question of national sovereignty and the question of democratic deficit within the EU as a whole. Those are all three very, very big things. And of course, at the moment, the cruelty handed out to Greece has seen something of a resurgence in this line. It's important to note, I think, that the position of capital has been historically rather split on the question of European membership. Certainly, again, now almost half a century ago, you had a real division between industrial capital in the UK and financial capital. Industrial capital very much always wanted to be a part of Europe, save for some small businesses that were always likely to go under because of European membership and that had relied precisely on tariff differences in tariff rates to survive thus far. So that's a historical split. And this is partly to do with London's interest in being a centre for Eurodollar banking. And those are deposits that are operative outside of the US but denominated in dollars and therefore free of certain rules that would be applied to them if they were within the United States. Yeah. And that's a source of huge profit for the city. So finance capital has since discovered that it actually doesn't mind being part of the EU. The EU is less dogmatic and less prone to regulation than had been suspected. And the configuration of industrial capital has changed. Britain certainly doesn't look like what it looked like about half a century ago.
Well, not even in the early 1990s, actually. Even by the end of the Thatcher regime, it was still much more of an industrial power than it is today.
Yeah. So in terms of capital's interest these days, while the split still exists and industrial and financial capital are interested in Europe for different reasons, there tends to be a reasonable unanimity across the board. There are dissidents within that class. I suppose it's interesting to say here that Great Britain's pretensions in 1970, 1971, and Great Britain's pretensions today haven't really changed that much. And it's partly a legacy of a sort of strange belief that flourished after the Second World War, that Britain had hoped it would be the centre of a tripartite axis of power. So on the one hand, part of the European bloc, which is what you would imagine. On the other hand, part of the North Atlantic bloc, so an important mediator between the powers in Europe and the powers of the United States in particular, and then also at the centre of a Commonwealth axis, which gave it unparalleled access to resources across the world. Now, things didn't turn out that way, but this spectre has nonetheless animated Britain's conception of itself in the world for so long, despite there being very little empirical evidence to demonstrate that is in fact how Britain operates.
I mean, you talk to anybody from any country and they'll always tell you their country is the centre of the world. I remember talking to Icelanders and they'd be saying, such an important country, slap bang in the middle of, Britain and America. And, so strategic. Actually, no, sorry, between the Soviet Union and the United States. So as an airbase, it was really important for long-range strategic bombers, particularly in the 1960s, 1970s. I think it was so strategically in the centre of the Norse world. You talk to somebody in Egypt, they go, look, this is the anchor of the Middle East, Africa, Europe. Talk to Britons at the heart of, So it depends, obviously, where you're coming from in terms of how you look at what you're at the heart of. But yes, Brits in particular have a geographical view of their centrality in the North Atlantic. That's kind of indisputable. Clearly, geographically, that they're at the periphery of Europe as well as politics until 1973, until membership of the European Union. And again, the Commonwealth. This was a club that was in economic dissolution by this moment, although obviously politically continued as it does to this day. This idea of the Euro-communist left, seeing the EU as a kind of lodestar for democratic aspiration, particularly as a kind of as a counterweight, I suppose, to what they viewed as a decimated left post-Thatcher. And I suppose you've got Reagan, the other side of the Atlantic. You're seeing Reagan, you're seeing Thatcher. It makes sense, to look at Europe as the kind of, this could be the forebear of something other than that. That makes sense. What I also want to really talk about today is what's the purpose of the figure. So when the intellectual figure of the EU for the imagination of the British left, what has it been for the last several decades? Does it allow the left actually to consistently evade really difficult questions like state power and international trade policy? People say, well, I would Caroline Lucas, great example. I think Caroline Lucas up there with the best of them in terms of parliamentarians. She said she wants Britain to stay in the EU. That's probably the real fundamental question we're going to get at today. We're going to attack, should Britain be in the EU? What does that mean in terms of a yes, no, in, out vote in 2017? Probably 2017. Could be 2016. Most likely 2017. She's saying, I would love to see a massively reformed Europe and Britain staying in. And Europe's only going to change by Britain staying in and arguing the case for reform. And we talked about this on the show, I think 3 weeks ago. You have to then say in response to that, what reforms? Where's the timetable? How's it going to happen? What's the base of social power behind it? Who's championing it? What are the demands? Nobody knows. She can't answer any. Caroline Lucas cannot answer any of those questions, not a single one today. As we'll discuss as the show proceeds, European federalism actually had a big social base and a real intellectual trajectory until the 1970s. People Altiero Spinelli coming out of the Communist Party, partisans, anti-fascists, communists, but who then understood the limits of state socialism, the limits of Stalinism. That didn't mean they went to libertarian communism. That meant they then became Euro-federalists. In a weird way, that still defines the thinking of much of the centre-left in Europe today. James?
Yeah, well, partly because the people in real positions of power in Europe probably studied under those same people, right? It can be 40 or 50 years ago, really. These people are generally very old. So there are a couple of things to pick up here, and one is actually what you're talking about in terms of social base. And that is going to be an interesting question when you look at the way in which the debate over Europe operated historically in the early 70s and the way it might operate now, or what it can be used for, what it's a staging ground for. And one of the ways to outline this is to trace the right-wing position, actually. And the right-wing position is interesting because in the, just a couple of years before this debate became big in Britain, we'd had a general election where Enoch Powell really set the tone. It's sort of Powell-like barbarism, really. Even to the point of worrying establishment organs. So you have William Rees-Mogg in the Times, sort of father of Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's now Tory MP, fulminating and sort of despairing about the direction of Britain and Europe. So this, there is a sense here that there is a danger of falling into parochialism or national chauvinism that animated the discussion at the time. Now, partisans of this discussion on either side called it the Great Debate, and it's striking, and it's a point that Nairn makes in the book that I mentioned earlier. It's striking that actually the debate was really transposed only into sort of institutions of quite a respectable civil society. It wasn't, and the point for comparison is another great debate that animated British political life at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, so from about 1890 to 1914. And that's the great Edwardian debate about imperialism. And it's a debate that rages not just in broadsheet columns and not just in speeches in Parliament, but in strikes, in social contestation in the street, in confused and angry protests, in
embryonic socialist movements.
Yeah. Well, the formation of the Labour Party. So there is all of this stuff going on at the time. That it strikes me as interesting that these are huge debates about the direction of a country, which are conducted in entirely different manners. In 1970, the debate about Europe was used to sublate emerging social conflicts. It was used in a way that the nation is often used in national economic policy, and ideas about the direction of a state among states are often used, as a sort of box of tricks that can transform these questions and remove them to a kind of more ethereal, abstract, or purely discursive plane. It was very much used as a lightning conductor in that sense. But what the Edwardian example tells us is that this needn't necessarily be the case. And my suspicion is that if those of us on the left are a little more cunning about this than people were in the 70s, if we sort of refuse to be corralled into broadsheets or merely into organs of opinion, or refuse the terms of the debate in the sense that we would refuse to have it purely discursive and actually realise that it's something that must animate the whole of society, then the question of Europe can become a real lightning conductor for all social struggles at the moment, because, it's unquestionable that people are looking at the treatment of Greece and thinking, what is this institution? What is happening here? What is it for? What is it designed for? Are the things that I thought 20 years ago when there was a reactionary political party attacking Europe and desiring our exit, well, I perhaps defended it because I felt that, say, the Conservative Party are necessarily reactionary. But actually, what is this institution that we're part of? How far does national sovereignty extend? How can I conduct myself in a Europe where I have no say over the way in which my life is governed and organised? So these questions can become really active and can become a really, really important part of social contestation. A couple of the things that I think are likely to happen in the course of this debate, in the course of this discussion, is that what will happen is that we will have a Prime Minister returning from Europe, and he will have negotiated probably some really rather minor concessions, but be able to do what Heath did.
Any of which will be further to the right of the status quo, right?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
Right.
And they will be minor.
And probably to do with opt-out on workers' rights and things like that.
Yeah. Which the left are then going to defend.
Yeah, of course. But,
or maybe not. That's where we come in. That's where us and OJ come in.
So there is a question here of avoiding that question of the Europe of nations, right?
Yeah.
Like that's a reactionary formation that says, the way in which this will operate is purely in terms of self-interest, right, and self-interest of a capitalist class with which the state is identified. So what will happen, I imagine, is that Cameron will return from Europe and do what Ted Heath did in the 70s and say, look, we have forward motion in Europe. Britain is really respected as a power.
There's really momentum for reform.
This is a thing that is not often respected in political analysis. It's exactly how seductive the idea of forward motion is, right? The idea that you're making progress, the idea that your representative has purchase within these sort of strange supranational organisations. So that will happen, and that will be deployed by Cameron. I imagine also that the other foundational part of this campaign will be about migration and will be about race. And the open question for me is actually how a left deals with that.
On that note, I'm going to quote here from Owen, article written on the 14th of July. That was just over 2 weeks ago. Here is an extract from that. Pretty good article, actually, in The Guardian. Let's just be honest about our fears. We fear that we will inadvertently line up with the xenophobes and the immigrant-bashing nationalists, and a no result will be seen as their vindication, unleashing a carnival of UKIPpery. Hostility to the EU is seen as the preserve of the hard right, and not the sort of thing progressives should entertain. And that is why, if indeed much of the left decides on Lexit, which is left exit, it must run its own separate campaign and try and win ownership of the issue. Such a campaign would focus on building a new Britain, one of workers' rights, a genuine living wage, public ownership, industrial activism and tax justice. Such a populist campaign could help the left reconnect with working class communities it lost touch with long ago. My fear otherwise, and I really, really couldn't emphasise this more, and I agree with it wholeheartedly, is a repetition of the Scottish referendum, but this time, instead of the progressive SNP as the beneficiaries, with UKIP mopping up in working class communities as big businesses issue chilling threats about the risks of voting the wrong way. Without a prominent left-out campaign, UKIP could displace Labour right across northern England. That would be the real vindication of UKIPpery. And I think Owen is absolutely spot on there, actually. And it's a bit of crystal ball gazing. It's not till 2017, but actually, in 2 years' time, with the experience of Scotland in September of last year, I don't think it's improbable. Actually, I think it's highly possible. You can see what a no result to the Indie Ref last year, how that animated the general election earthquake of the SNP. In May, they got 56 out of 59 Scottish seats. Could something similar happen with UK? No, look, on this show, we're the naysayers, we're the pessimist. Well, James is, the kind of easy binary here is that James is the sort of pessimist and I'm the shouty optimist. That to some extent is true, but we can be quite pessimistic on this show, or at least sceptical. I think scepticism is a very healthy and useful attribute in politics and analysing public life. It's not unthinkable that, and I said this a couple of weeks ago, Farage, a week after a vote to stay in the EU, 55-45 split, it would be that close. It will not be an overwhelming vote to stay in, I don't think. It may be 60-40 tops. Farage can say, again, this is absolutely, this is not actually that far from the truth, against big business, the entire media, all the papers, all the political parties. He can even say, look, not just Labour, not just the Conservatives, not just the Lib Dems, the SNP. The entire political class, right? Even in Scotland, the entire political class, the entire media establishment, financial interests, industrial interests, were all aligned against the democratic impulses of the British people to leave the EU. And we almost did it. And he'd be right. He would be absolutely right. And at that point you go, well, what would that mean in terms of electoral outcomes, a couple of years later in 2020? We thought he would get, the polling was saying before May that UKIP would get at least 12 seats. Nate Silver at the New York Times doesn't get much wrong. He said that it would get tops 3 seats. They ended up getting just the one. They lost one of the ones that they'd gained through a by-election, Mark Reckless. He must, Jesus, he had the charisma of a centipede. I don't know how he got into Parliament in the first place. Politicians are meant to have something. If not ideals, at least the televisual appeal. But yeah, he could say that. And I think there would be some kind of electoral advantage that would be conferred by that. Would it be huge, like OJ saying they'd replace him across the north of England? I don't think so. I think they would certainly benefit. Again, they do very well in European elections. They would continue to make headway at the local level, as they first did in 2013. I think they would start to win city mayors. Even if they win no more MPs, that's bad enough. They'll win police commissioners. This is bad enough, right? Because people in control of local police forces could be, ex-members of the National Front, as was the South Thanet constituency organiser, in the seat that Farage contested. This gentleman was a former member of the National Front. This is not me slandering his name, defaming him in public. This is a matter of public record. So even if they don't get that advantage at a general election in 2020, I think they would actually. I think they'd probably get 5, 10, 15 MPs. That depends on a lot of variables, how much money, where the mainstream media is at, and just how far down the line we are with the Labour Party's collapse. If Corbyn doesn't win this thing, I actually think Labour could lose a fair few seats in the north. If they don't get a leader that consolidates their left vote, their industrial working class vote, which is obviously overwhelmingly in the north. If they don't get Corbyn in September, if they got, say, Burnham or even worse, Cooper, I actually think UKIP could really, there's a perfect storm there of a Cooper leadership, Britain staying in the EU, but it's a really close vote. If that happens, I think it's highly likely UKIP would benefit to a really substantial extent in the 2020 general election. James?
Yes, I think that's certainly possible. There are, of course, advantages to UKIP in the case of an exit as well, right? That this will say, we have been proven right. We have been proven right. We are the only party that is a expression of the volonté générale.
Would they dissolve though? That's the question. Because they of course they wouldn't, right?
No, because there is always a way of making a case that there is some sort of cosmopolitan parasite, for instance.
The WTO.
Yeah.
The menace of the EU is still at the door, because we're still in this new organisation, which is like a elementary trade union or something.
But I want to go back to the question of what exactly the EU is, because it's not clear, is it? And it is there are reams of largely unreadable academic work done on this, which sheds much heat and no light on the question of what the EU is. But one of the things that is striking is one, that it is primarily a creation of bureaucrats. Now, this leads to a certain somewhat unrefined and occasionally sort of somewhat impressionistic argument that the EU is purely bureaucratic. It isn't. It has various elements to it. But it is largely the brainchild of people like Jean Monnet, who's a very interesting character. He actually just before the end of the Second World War, it's 1943, he says there will be no peace in Europe if the states are reconstituted on the basis of national sovereignty. The countries of Europe are too small to guarantee their peoples the necessary prosperity and social development. The European states must constitute themselves into a federation. So, in addition to your tracing of a genealogy of European federalism arising out of a left or left communist or whatever sort of anti-national communist tradition. So a left Europeanism. There is a sort of technocratic or bureaucratic Europeanism that takes as its pretext, one, that people largely can't be trusted to vote the right way. Monnet never stood for office. He was
None of them do.
No, too taxing. So he is really the architect of Europe as it stands. But the thing is that things get in his way. De Gaulle, for instance, gets in his way. Various elements within the European superstructure get in the way. So Monnet's vision of a federal Europe, which is a crucial part of the genetics of European institutions, right? So right after the establishing treaties, and I'm thinking here, after the Treaty of Rome,
57.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have these embryonic institutions that will become, so the Assembly will become the European Parliament. You get eventually the administrative body that deals with trade disputes becomes the European Court of Justice. So these institutions are there and they're embryonic, but part of their genetics is towards a European federalism. But it is compromised by the fact that there are resistant forces within Europe to this idea. Now, de Gaulle is one of them. De Gaulle is a real skeptic about European federalism, and he's sort of very powerful at the point at which it is an issue. But one of the other influences, and perhaps something that will surprise listeners, is Hayek. Now, Hayek writes in 1939, I believe, an essay called The Economic Conditions of Interstate Federalism. And here he argues for a federation of nation-states on the assumption that the myth of nationality, while it can be used to repress pure and unlimited free trade within a nation-state, when you're dealing with a body that has to deal with the individual myths of nationhood held onto by lots of different states, has to step back, actually, and actually has to allow far greater and sort of less restrained free trade. And so he hopes... and it's a strange essay to write in 1939, by the way, because remember what else is happening in 1939. But he hopes a federal state will get out of the way of free trade. And so this influence is there as well in the foundation of the European Union. In fact, by the time the Schuman Declaration comes out, and that's 52, I think. Hayek is a bit sceptical. He says, actually, this looks a bit too dirigiste for my liking. It actually accords far too many powers to the central executive. And so this is one side of the sort of prime material that goes into the alchemical melting pot that becomes Europe. Because, you have this unparalleled opportunity after World War II to reconstitute this international body of completely wrecked nations. One of the other things that becomes clear is a point of view that's articulated by Wynne Godley a lot later. He's an economist, a rather obscure economist these days, but sort of left-wing-ish economist. And he points out that actually there cannot be, without sort of centralized institutions with power over sort of quite substantial fiscal powers, without sort of serious powers of sovereignty, there cannot be a European monetary union which isn't prone to crisis. And so in many ways, Godley actually anticipates the Greek crisis that we're living through at the moment. So on the other hand, you have these two things pulling at each other. In the basis of the European project. On the other hand, you also have a sort of a communist skepticism. It's a skepticism that goes back to Rosa Luxemburg, that says, actually, we're not for pan-Europeanism. We are internationalists. And any subfraction of internationalism is toxic, is dangerous. It constitutes itself by an externality and is inevitably given over to chauvinism. This is probably even more the case in somewhere like Europe, where pan-Europeanism becomes either a sort of rather threadbare cover for economic domination by a single nation state, or it becomes a mode of exploitation, primarily imperialistic in nature. So those are some of the things that go into the basis of the European project, and that's so you have this rather compromised institution that is difficult to understand, partly because it is such a compromise between all of these forces, and what's interesting is that it's really after 1986, so when we come into the present day, we come into the one point where the UK has been really dominant in Europe, and that's Thatcher, the Single European Act in 1986. This is hugely important.
She got our money back.
Yes, Andreotti accused her of being like a landlady berating a tenant for her rent. In the negotiations leading up to it. I mean, interestingly enough, the Italians and the Italian-British conflict within Europe is a particularly important one because Italians do tend to have this commitment to Europe as an institution. It's a strange fact of Italian political life. Anyway, I wanted to bearing these things in mind, go back to something that Marx said many years ago now. And that is that the transcendence of the nation-state would be the task of labour rather than capital. And if that's the case, then we haven't been doing terribly well. And at the beginning of the Cold War, Kojev, a theorist, says whichever camp in the Cold War, either the Soviet camp or the West, accomplishes the transcendence of the nation-state will win the Cold War. And when the EEC is formed, Kojev basically says, well, the West will win. It turns out to be right, of course. And yet the EU is a strange confection. It's not Hayek's Catalaxy. It's not Monnet's Federal Europe. It's a conflicted series of institutions that only really advances in moments of crisis and in contingency. One of the things that leads to Britain's membership of the European Union is the collapse of Bretton Woods. The impetus for the city to change its interest in American finance is precisely the Nixon shock. The city realizes it actually needs anchoring to some serious ballast outside of itself, and America starts to look less stable.
It looks a lot less stable now than it does today, for instance.
So you get these sort of advances precipitated by moments of crisis, and that's one of the things to bear in mind when we're thinking about how Europe is functioning today. If we look at what's happening in Greece and we look at what's likely to happen in the coming years, because look, the Greek crisis isn't over. The crisis of the debtor countries in the European periphery is not over.
Well, look, Jeremy Corbyn told me just 2 days ago, he said, 2020, Europe's going to look very different than it does today, believe me. And he said that the crisis currently afflicting Greece will, and this guy could be the next leader of the opposition. No, but these are arguments that have real currency now, actually. What's happening in Greece, by virtue of the structure, the commitments of what single monetary union means, Italy will inevitably follow. Spain will inevitably follow, as will Portugal and most likely Ireland. Sorry.
Yeah. No. I'm in complete agreement with you, and I think one of the things that's really interesting here is to look at historical conceptions of what people thought that Europe might be in, say, 10 years' time. Major thought that Russia was going to join the EU. I mean, this seems unimaginable now.
Well, not a lot of people know this. In 1992, Barcelona Olympics, do you know what CIS's national anthem was?
No.
Have a guess. Ode to Joy. European national anthem. And the only other country that's ever had that was Kosovo immediately after leaving Serbia. Yes. And so this is kind of like, you talk about how crisis gives rise to new possibilities that you just did not see them coming. That's a classic example, right? The CIS Ode to Joy. This is just, wow, this is bananas, really.
But let's take, in terms of ways that people
the Ninth Symphony for
think about Europe. The question of what people think of when they think of Europe. If one sort of thinks back prior to the onset of the financial crisis, which does seem like a different country now, and even further back, right back to the Blair years, you had this strange creature inhabiting Whitehall called Mark Leonard. And Mark Leonard was the top foreign policy myrmidon.
At a very young age.
At a very young age. He was the sort of wunderkind of Whitehall. I don't know what he's doing now, actually. But
absolutely nothing. He basically started his own think tank at like 25 or something.
Disgusting human being. Anyway, he writes a book about Europe, basically. He writes a book about how Europe will run the 21st century. And he starts reaching for a metaphor to describe the EU, or a point of comparison. He's saying, what is the best thing that you can compare the European Union to, and what is the term of praise that you should use for the European Union? He compares it not to any political structure, but to an international finance company, Visa. That was his highest form of praise. That is the laudatory achievement of the Blair years. This is what Europe is. Europe is like Visa.
You can imagine them talking about Tony Blair recalling this to another sort of chef de camp. Look, it's like Visa. Isn't that, when you use your Visa, it's easy, isn't it? Look, that's like the EU. Look.
This was the currency. This was the intellectual currency of the time. That was the highest form of praise.
This was before the GFC, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
right.
some of this nonsense was just being sort of uncritically, swallowed.
But then the political question that presents itself to the left, as far as the EU is concerned, is exactly this: if we accept it's necessary to transcend the nation state, if we agree with Marx, if we say it's necessary and not just necessary, should be the task of Labour, can the EU be a vehicle for that? If not, why not? And if we're to leave, how do we avoid breakdown into national chauvinism or a regressive model that depends on the exploitation of peripheries for a type of colonial rent on which to found domestic prosperity?
It's a really key point. I'm going to keep that in mind. I just want to add one thing. There is absolutely no denial that a lot of policymakers, I don't say politicians because nobody's voted for them, a lot of policymakers at the top of the EU food chain do want a superstate. Now, I know William Hague and sort of Ian Duncan Smith were saying this in the early noughties, and now Farage is saying it. That doesn't make it any less true just because a bunch of Wallies are saying it consistently for decades. It is true. I mean, if you look at the nature of what the European Constitution was all about, it had loads of weird sort of nationalia surrounding it, a flag, a motto, an anthem, all of which were dropped in the Treaty of Lisbon, with the exception, of course, of the Euro. The Ninth Symphony was going to be the European national anthem. If you look at the kind of the patina of flags that surround the European project, people know, of course, the European Union flag, the 27 stars on the blue background, right? But there's a flag for the kind of Western European Defence Organisation, all these, the European Council. Yeah. There's flags. It's weird because you look at the American Civil War, you look at the flags, the Confederacy and the North, and there were various flags during the American Civil War, and they all kind of looked the same. It's kind of like a circle of stars, and then some stripes, and then like a triangle, and all these. There's literally dozens of flags surrounding the European project. It's not just the one that we all recognise at the top of municipal buildings, with the exception, of course, of Britain, because we don't actually, we don't tend to stick to the script with these kinds of things. But yes, there is a real project to create a European superstate. And I said this quote 2 weeks ago, Massimo D'Azeglio. He recalled in his memoirs, he was the prime minister of the antecedent political what would you call it, entity, the entity that anteceded Italy, which was the kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia. He was the prime minister of that, which then became Italy, under the same royal family, the House of Savoy. And he said, we've made Italy, now we must make Italians. And this is something that is, repeated, actually, quoted literally verbatim by, very senior people within the European project. So, Hague and Duncan Smith, and they're not making this up. This is something that they'd like to do, and I think they do recognise that in order to make this European state, they need a European people, a European demos. They want to create a European civil society,
yes.
Albeit a very different one to us. So when you have, for instance, trade agreements with Sub-Saharan Africa, which were renegotiated at some point in the middle of the last decade, they include civil society, right? They get all these civil society organisations, but this is civil society by management, not membership. They want a particular kind of civil society, right? They want the civil society of NGOs and the third sector, not of democratic participatory organisations. The second that rears its head, as it has done in Greece with the recent Oki vote, they run a mile. So, yeah, James.
Yeah, so those who were listening 2 weeks ago will remember I gave something of a potted history of Europe's relation two sort of economic conditions, economic crisis, right? So you have, after the Second World War, this explosion in domestic growth, right? It's called the Trente Glorieuses in France, the economic miracle in Italy, the golden age in Britain. So this is the classic era of sort of Keynesian, welfarist policy. You have after that Thatcherism. You have, of course, also in that early period an explosion in international trade, and that is actually really important, and that's part of the driver for European integration, right? And the idea is that the member states will found domestic prosperity and their welfarist model on these things. Unfortunately, you do run into a problem in terms of what Harold Wilson called in a speech to Guildhall in 1969, I believe. He said, "We face the problem of an assertion of the power of the factory floor, a problem which is growing throughout Europe, and a problem to which no country has found the answer."
Neo-Ricardian crisis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And much of the decade that follows is an attempt to deal with that and a failure to deal with that. And really, it's only when the axe of monetarism falls that this starts to get dealt with.
Yeah.
So I gave that history the last time we were speaking, and one of the things I want to talk about now is a different kind of political history of the EU, and it's a history sort of addressed in some of the scholarship on it, and it's addressing the question of whether the European Union can be considered as a state. And almost all critical work begins by saying the EU is not a state. It fits no classical definition of what a state is. And one of the scholars that I particularly admire on this issue is Stefano Bartolini, in a book called Restructuring Europe, begins basically by saying, what if the EU is, if not a state, then a process or the next step in state formation? And he says, okay, let's track the development of nation states. He says, and so he gives these sort of broad historical phases. And as with all broad historical phases, there are questions of interpenetration and exactly in terms of dividing line. But he says, okay, so one, you have coercive, right? It's passage from feudalism to absolutism and so on. Two, you have a proto-capitalist phase. And so markets tend to emerge actually in the regions that are least centralized. Three, you have national. And that's a process that happens where you have a homogenization of a culture, the extension of a single language, often accompanied by standardization of printing.
Conscription.
Yes, very much. You have after that the democratic phase, so the extension of the franchise, suffrage becomes a political and foundational issue. And then you have the social sharing phase, and that's the creation of the welfarist models we've talked about much on the show. So you have here this thing that happens. So it's coincidence of military, economic, social and constitutional functions within national boundaries. And these developments largely depend on system building processes, right? So they all involve sort of building a kind of system, and they build on top of the stratum that preceded it. And this is especially, the creation of a national identity, the laying out of political functions, sometimes in the form of a constitution, the development of social security apparatus. So the question then to ask is it possible that the EU could be a sixth stage of state formation, repeating all of those things, those five phases, those five processes, on a continental level? We can accept that after World War II, integration arises because national states are no longer siloized. You have what I called, and what the literature calls, the neo-realist approach, right, that says there are domestic objectives that are behind integration. But it's also because the states after World War II are no longer siloized in the same way. They're no longer sort of cut off from each other. And that's partly because security and monetary policy power passes over the Atlantic, right? So it's in the hands of the Americans. The individual costs, particularly of military competition and the risk of economic peripheralization, are just unbearable by nation states. And this is one of the things that conjures the common market into existence. But by conjuring the common market into existence, by the coal and steel community and then the economic community that follows, it breaks the boundaries of the nation state as it had existed hitherto. That's not really controversial. And it's the basis of the sovereignty objection to the existence of the EU. It's the basis of the kind of Burkean disgust with which some Tories view the European project. And from a left perspective, it's also worth reading Wynne Godley on this, the economist I mentioned earlier. And by the time you get to the Maastricht Treaty, 92, yep. This is an attempt to re-Europeanize certain sort of monetary powers and military policies, right? But what about the other functions? Now, obviously, centralization and power formation, coercive power formation, has proceeded apace. If you look at the way Brussels operates, you have this incredibly complex layer of decision-making processes where the division between technocratic and commercial interests are very blurry, as is the division between legislative and executive function. You have 32 different procedures which are comprehensible only to specialist lawyers and functionaries. 3/4 of the Council's decisions are approved without discussion and are made and prepackaged in the depths of something called Coreper, which is the Committee of Permanent Representatives. And the connections between national bureaucracies and community machinery multiplies endlessly in this rather subterranean way, absolutely unexposed to any kind of public scrutiny. 90% of the lobbies in the huge and extensive committee system in Brussels are business organizations of some kind. Trade unions, environmentalists, feminist groups lobbyists make up less than 5%. The redistributive functions that are sometimes accorded to Brussels are territorial rather than social. That is, they are redistributions between political entities rather than social strata. Social expenditure is tiny, absolutely tiny. No such thing as European citizenship exists, right? So it's not like those stages of state formation where you have, this homogenization of a culture or sort of symbolic or political investment in the nation state. No one thinks of themselves as a European first and foremost. It's just not true. It doesn't happen. The notion of a European citizenship, if it exists at all, probably exists within about 3 feet radius of Jürgen Habermas.
There is some data, obviously, on there's survey data. I think that's it's been collected year on year for decades in terms of do you feel European or not. I think the number actually is going down, even in very Europhile countries such as Italy, actually, in recent years. I think what's a seismic moment for the left and its commitment to anybody that is saying they're I'm a passionate European, people that were saying that 10 years ago, I think TTIP and Greece has quite possibly changed that.
Well, it's one of the things that's interesting is that, right, so in the absence of this citizenship, what you have is a monetary union. So you do have strong economic boundaries to the Eurozone, a very distinct sense of what Europe is there. It's patrolled by the ECB, but doesn't have any institutional goals beyond its mere existence. Doesn't have any, sense that it has a political function, doesn't have any sense that it has a political aim, at least explicitly, although I'm sure in the private recesses of Jerome Dijsselbloem's mind it's rather different. It simply looks like an instrument for disciplining state behaviours. And in fact, Bartolini suggests this in 2005, a book written in 2005, a decade before this situation in Greece, before the financial crisis. He says, look at the way the ECB is set up. It's there to discipline states. That's what it's for. And in fact, in the absence of anything else, it's what it looks like, its exclusive purposes.
I mean, Mason spoke in Athens a week ago at this thing that Craig McVeigh was at, editor-in-chief of Novara. And Mason said, he goes, we now know that, the traditional Keynesian stimulus is off the toolkit of European finance ministers. We've known this, for well over a decade. You're not meant to be running a deficit in excess of 3%. Which, what country was the worst? Who was breaking that year after year, to the utmost extent? It was Germany, actually. It was Germany in the early noughties. Nobody's talking about that anymore. So that has been, if not in practice, in theory, off the table of European finance ministers for quite some time. James?
Yeah, so the other thing that that is constitutive of Europe is, of course, internal and border security. I mean, that really is what makes Europe, isn't it? You have Frontex and Urgent-For, and the current refugee crisis is, of course, hugely important in this regard.
Most militarised borders in the world are those currently surrounding Europe. There's huge investment by the Turks,
And-
by the Greeks, in terms of securing their land borders.
And as Daniel Trilling made clear when he was on this show, external camps, right? Beyond the border, sort of, weird enclaves of European power in non-European countries.
Can I just say, I said this on the last show 2 weeks ago. People say, well, look, Europe means that we've got free movement. 450 million Europeans can move around these 27 member states with such ease. Absolutely. That's premised on keeping the rest of the world out. With the exception of, some North Americans and wealthy East Asians and Russians. That's premised on keeping the rest of the world out. And as the climate crisis leads to hundreds of millions, at least 100 million, according to very, substantial organisations, climate refugees, as we see huge demographic change, doubling of the population of the continent of Africa between now and 2050, all of these pressures mean that problem, that fissure of free movement within and delimitation from without, is going to really be a difficult one for the left, or even just vague social democrats, progressives to defend.
It's
Anybody who has a heart,
It's
effectively.
interesting, I suppose, to say that yes, of course, the other competency here that Europe has is the ECJ, right, which continually aggregates its ability to form law, and most recently it has extended its competencies to labour law. It's one of the reasons that, of course, David Cameron wants to opt out of its rulings. So beyond these competencies, and if it has, as we say, no symbolic sense of citizenhood, no social mesh binding people together, as in the functions that we've discussed, it has political representation barely worth a name. The European Parliament is mostly marked by absenteeism.
It's a rubber stamp. Yeah.
European parties are a joke.
Yeah.
They're mostly funnels for cash. It is essentially what you would call European, like elite consolidation.
Yeah.
Bartolini calls it collusive democracy. So questions of legitimacy never arise because electorates can't divide over questions because they have no access to them.
Here's a great demand, right? People saying we need to reform the EU. So trade policy is delegated entirely to the European Commission. There was greater democratic oversight for Britain and its, British trade policy in relation to the rest of the world. There was more democratic oversight after the 1832 Great Reform Act than there is today. It's overseen by unelected European commissioners. And that is a really simple demand. You could say we want EU trade policy. We want all of the existent, agreements and conventions that have been signed up to by the Commission, and all the antecedent treaties that all go all the way back to 1957. We want them to be renegotiated by the European Parliament, signed by the European Parliament, and this competence has to move to the European Parliament. That will never happen. That cannot happen. And you're talking about what binds, what's the commonality, what's the mesh, the social, intellectual, cultural mesh of Europe. Well, I tell you what, it binds actually the capitalist classes together, and it binds their histories pretty well together. You look at the history of the German capitalist class, the French capitalist class, the British capitalist class, colonialism, imperialism, the birth of industrial capitalism in the 19th century. Yeah, they share a hell of a lot. The ruling class of Germany, Britain, France, Italy look at one another. Then they look at the equivalent in India, China, Iran, the great powers of the last several centuries, Turkey, Russia. And they don't really share very much with them, right? The ruling classes of Europe share a heck of a lot. The working classes, they share a lot. They share just as much with the working classes of the rest of the world. James, I want to return a quick point, and I'm going to ask you a question because we've got just under 10 minutes. You're listening to Novara FM, here on Resonance 104.4.
I suppose I just basically wanted to draw from this is that you have, within the European project, erosion of national state boundaries in economic, legal and administrative terms, their retrenchment in terms of sort of social and political boundaries, in fact. But they're precarious, right? The processes that constituted the nation state, so to answer Bartolini's question, right? The processes that constituted the nation state haven't actually been recapitulated, but disaggregated, right? They've been torn apart. So the conceptions about how you operate politically on a national stage are very different now because you don't have the final result of those processes within one boundary. You have some here and some there, and neither of them quite effective on the other.
I've got a question for you. You're saying, is the EU a state? I would then ask you a question, which is, was the United States a state between 1776 and between the Civil War? Because you have a clear difference in the economic base of the North and the South, especially after the explosion of the cotton trade, which necessitated slavery in the South, what became the Confederacy. So you have a clear distinction in the economic base. There was clear constitutional contradictions in terms of, there were ideological and, contradictions of identity. Mm-hmm. People saw themselves as a Virginian, not an American. And, Lincoln, 1860, the Republican Party, anti-slavery, Lincoln wins the presidency without a single Southern state. At which point the South goes, we're not represented, our interests aren't represented. The entire economy of the South is based on slave ownership. It's not an ideological thing where they hate black people. They did that too, yeah? They hated slaves, they thought they were less than human, but there was also an economic imperative about upholding slavery, which, the South really was invested in, the North wasn't. It was an industrial, advanced economy by the standards of the mid-19th century. So, my question then is this: to resolve those contradictions in terms of the economic base, in terms of the needs of these, today you'd say, look at the European core, look at the European periphery. They've got really divergent needs too, right? Really divergent identities. They don't feel represented by the constitutional status quo of Europe. Europe, to me, today looks like a confederacy of states, a confederation of states, rather than a federation of states. Now, in the United States, that was resolved through civil war. Like I said, that quote by Otto von Bismarck, through blood and iron.
Yes.
Just like with the unification of Germany. And I think what's clear now with Europe is that legal constitutional progress is now coming up against a barrier, and that something more is necessary. And politics by the means war. We're seeing social war in Greece. It's being imposed through diktat and enforced by the state. Is that a useful metaphor? Is that a useful referent in terms of understanding the European crisis? If we look at the contradictions between the American North and South, and that was resolved through civil war.
Yeah. The answer is partially.
Yeah.
You're quite right, I think, to suggest that those distinctions are the kind of distinctions that would have historically been resolved by civil war.
Yeah.
Civil war of that kind is not possible in Europe at the moment, thankfully. It is not possible west of Germany. It's not possible really that France and Germany are going to go to war, for instance. I mean, this is the ultimate. No. This is the ultimate.
But a military coup in Greece. I mean, that's not the equivalent. I mean, that would be an act of civil war within the European Union.
But you won't get a civil war equivalent to the American Civil War
and seceding. Of course not. No, of course not. But a coup in Greece, they would secede, and then that might lead to other nations in Europe's periphery leaving.
Yeah, but the way that this happens is largely by administrative coup these days. Largely, I think a military coup is actually extremely unlikely in Greece.
Oh no, I agree with you. But what would, let's say that happened. Let's say Greece secedes, leaves the Union. What would be the response then of Europe and the great powers of Europe's north, like Germany? They would say it's undemocratic. They have to stay in. I mean, what would they do in terms of imposing a regime there?
Yes, it's an
important question.
It's absolutely possible that in that moment you have the argument that has been made about Greece recently, which is that the people of a single nation state cannot decide on their own what they do, because they have now obligations to over 20 other nation states, right? And their decision affects them. And so on that basis, you have a basis for interference. And this is precisely the contradiction that is never really resolved in the course of the European project. Because let's take a longer historical perspective, right? You have three unifications. The historical Christian unification of Europe, didn't think of itself as Europe, thought of itself as Christendom. The Enlightenment, which really dissolves with Jacobinism and Napoleonism and the retrenchment post-Waterloo. Again, didn't think of itself in a European, primarily as European, although you have Montesquieu and various people talking about a Europe of trade. Burke, of course, says that we are at war with an armed ideology in relation to the destruction of the Enlightenment by the French Revolution. And you have this European project, the European project that rises up after World War II. It's the first European project, the project of unification, that thinks of itself as primarily European. That's important. It's a novelty that it considers itself as such. It's a project. But what is it a project for? And because of the absence of an answer to this, because of the historical answer being it's for itself, right? The creation of its institutions was its own aim. And, even Habermas admits this. In the absence of a final goal, a final motive, it becomes dystopic in that it's a grey dystopia of a kind of normal functioning, a nightmare of sort of feckless boredom in which all struggle or direction is effaced in a kind of capitalist irenicism. Building the institutions was the goal, but now the institutions exist. What are they for? If they are hijacked purely by the interests of capital, then you get situations like you have in Greece. The question that a Europhile leftist would pose in this case is, are we not left with the only option, which is fuite en avant, to flee forwards, right? Because to drop out of the EU, to break the European project, is precisely to boost the kind of national chauvinisms that it was designed, or partly designed, to overcome.
We've got 2 minutes left. We've barely touched this topic, Jem. This should be a whole series. Maybe we'll start a new radio show about should we leave the EU. I'll talk for 1 minute and then you can wrap up. I think we need to leave the EU, and I'll tell you why. Right now, the European Union, you look at the European Commission, has all these competences. It's a highly undemocratic way of doing things, much less so than at any point in Britain's history, like I say, since 1832. I don't think that's defensible. I don't think it's going to change. If it's going to change, it's going to need a huge amount of social power. We don't see that at the moment. Unless people can start advancing really serious demands, the serious social base behind them, I don't think there's much to it. And also, right now, in terms of global neoliberalism, global trade, the WTO, its policy is dictated by three powers, the EU, Japan, the USA. They're called the Triad. This is a huge base of social power for the transnational capitalist class that we could potentially take away from them. What would replace it? I don't know, but I don't think it could be that much worse. James?
Yes, okay, I'll agree with you. I just want to hear an argument that explains to me how we won't descend into national chauvinism and possibly war. I mean, that is the real question.
Ditto. And I want to hear some demands
how you don't sort of have climate migrants dying at your borders.
Yeah.
Those are the questions I want to answer.
On that optimistic note, James, you've been great. This is Novara FM. My name's Aaron Bastani. See you same time, same place next week. Bye.